Hello and welcome back to Bibliotherapy Live. Tonight's theme is going to be petrol in fiction, also known as Petrofiction. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you last week. I was in Cornwall at the North Cornwall Book Festival, having taken some of my portraits of authors to that wonderful festival. I was also doing bibliotherapy while I was there. I did bibliotherapy sessions with anyone that wanted to come along, and that was great fun. And it was really lovely to be at a literary festival, meeting real people, meeting new authors, getting to hang out with lots of lovely literary folk. So I didn't do a session last week, but when I was coming back, I, like many people who are probably with me tonight, was having issues with getting petrol and actually thought I might not be able to come back all the way to Sussex from North Cornwall, because on Monday morning, there I was at a petrol station in the middle of nowhere, queuing for about half an hour trying to fill up my car, which was almost empty, knowing that I had to go all the way back on a 6-hour journey back to Brighton. Luckily, I was able to fill up my car. But while I was thinking about this, I began to ponder what books should one read when waiting for petrol at a petrol station. Hi, Helen. Great to see you here this evening. I wonder if you're experiencing the petrol crisis where you are. Do let me know. So I began thinking about petrol in books, and the obvious ones that come to mind immediately are ones where you have conflagrations initiated by petrol, such as Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, which many of you might have recently watched on, I think it was on Netflix, and I did love that adaptation. It is a great story. I don't want to tell people about it and give away the plot, but there is a conflagration involved, started by petrol. Not too much of a giveaway, knowing the title, Little Fires Everywhere. Another book that came to mind, which I also don't want to give spoilers, but it's another book which involves fires started by petrol, is an amazing, brilliant young adult novel called We Were Liars by E. Lockhart, which is a book that you read from start to finish, wonder what on earth is going on, come to the end, and have an absolute epiphany and revelation and realize that you've got to go back to the beginning and read the whole book again. So that's one I would definitely say please read, and I won't tell you any more about because I really don't want to give away the story. Chris, great to see you joining me this evening. And Colleen, lovely to have you here. Do share any of your petrol waiting stories while we're here. If anyone wants to type a little bit on the Instagram screen or tell me on Facebook if you've had any stories of having to wait for hours at petrol stations. And if you have you listened to an audiobook? Have you just drummed your fingers in great frustration? Or have you even had a book to hand that you might have started reading to keep you company while you sat there waiting? I do wonder what the rules are about reading books while you drive. It has been known for me to read a book while stuck in a traffic jam on the M25, and I've had some quite dubious looks as I've been moving incredibly slowly with a book in one hand. Probably not something to recommend, but I wonder if it ought to be as illegal as using your phone while you drive. Something that maybe I need to investigate with the DVLA. So when I was investigating this idea, thinking about petrol in fiction and getting beyond the idea of mere conflagrations, I started looking up books and Googling petrol in fiction. and rapidly came across the term, which I did not know before, I must admit, petrofiction. I didn't know that petrofiction was a thing, and it does mean fiction that involves the investigation and the social effect of petrol and oil on the current world. It was actually coined as a term by Amitav Ghosh when he was writing a review about a book by fellow novelist Abdul Rahman Munif, who wrote a book called Cities of Salt in 1992, which is actually the first of a tetralogy, that's 4 books, which is all about the oil industry in the East. And that became an incredibly famous and important book. So it was Amitav Ghosh, who coined the term petrofiction, which I do think is a rather great fact, and we will be talking more about that later. But I'd also just like to point out that the word petroleum, you might have forgotten if it's been a while since you did geography or a biology lesson, actually means rock or oil from the earth. Petroleum literally means rock oil, which is also something that I'd forgotten about. And that's a rather great fact to rediscover, because it seems so much more impressive and awesome to think of it as rock oil, not just this annoying smelly substance that we get out of a pump in a petrol station, or which we can't get when we see all the signs saying that the petrol stations are all empty and there's no fuel or diesel. Colleen and Tracy, great to see you here as well on Facebook. Lovely to see people joining us from around the world. And this theme is obviously based on the current petrol crisis that we're having in the UK, which is actually purely caused by panic buying. So it definitely does have quite an apocalyptic kind of vibe. And the other books that very much came to mind when I started thinking about this idea of petrol in fiction were apocalyptic novels, because there are so many apocalyptic novels in which petrol plays a very important role as people slowly run out of petrol and have to find other means of transport. Even in the good old days of the Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, petrol was key in that people were trying to get away from London and get away from the mad rampaging plants, and they needed petrol in their cars to get away, and petrol gradually became an incredibly important commodity. So petrofiction has been going for a long time. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about that idea before we talk about particular books. Works of petrofiction proliferated in the 2000s and the 2010s, along with a growing critical focus as a result of concerns about climate change and oil. It actually started off the idea also of climate fiction. So petrofiction came first, apparently, and then climate fiction came second. And climate fiction is also known as Cli-Fi. I didn't know that either, which I think is a rather great term. And I might have to do a session all about Cli-Fi quite soon, because it's obviously closely related to ideas about petrol in fiction, as petrol is not exactly climate friendly. Some critics have connected the role of petrofiction to the emergence of climate fiction, in that both petrofiction and climate fiction are evaluating and addressing the concerns brought on by the industrial world that we live on and in. Climate fiction obviously is literature that deals with climate change and global warming. It's not necessarily speculative in nature, it's not necessarily sci-fi, it's quite often based on truth and reality, and that is definitely true of the book I was mentioning earlier, Cities of Salt by Abdul Rahman Munif, more of which in a minute. But I just want to add that we also have a term called post-petroleum fiction. So we've got petrofiction, Cli-Fi, and then there's also post-petroleum fiction, which is fiction that imagines a world beyond petrol. So a world when petrol and oil are no longer used, and a world where we have got beyond using fossil fuels. And there's a rather fascinating author called John Michael Greer, who is the host of the blog The Archdruid Report, and I believe that he himself is a druid, which is a weekly blog about various issues relating to climate change and fiction. And he's collected a book called After Oil, SF Visions of a Post-Petroleum World, which was published in 2012, which brings together 12 tales which are selected from a huge number that he got sent to him, in which each story offers glimpses into possible futures where oil scarcity and lower energy availability spell the end of modern industrial society. So the authors of those short stories have spent a lot of time thinking about a world without petrol, how it would work, and how the world might be after some form of apocalypse that ends our petroleum dependency. So those stories are a really interesting collection with possibly a bit of a druidic overview, which make them all the more interesting. As a break from all this rather heavy scientific terminology, I would just like to bring in a rather excellent choice of book which does relate to petrol. Tintin's Land of the Black Gold by Hergé, which is a great Tintin book, which is very much about petrol, and it tells the story of, it's quite a complex story in fact, but in a way it starts off quite simply with petrol tanks exploding through some mysterious reason which nobody quite understands. Across Europe, car engines are spontaneously exploding, and this coincides with the spectre of a potential war throughout the continent, causing Captain Haddock to be mobilised into the Navy. Good old Captain Haddock, you've got to love him. He always makes me laugh just to see him and his hilarious beard. And the Thompson twins are in there too. Tintin and the detectives attempt to come to the rescue to save the day from all these exploding cars and the strange bug that seems to have got into the petrol. And they discover a conspiracy involving a crew member on a petrol tanker, the Speedol Star. The three then work undercover in the ship, the Star, and they try to unfold what is going on with this strange conspiracy. So I won't tell you all about it in detail, but it's got some really excellent moments of comedy. There's lots of exploding cars, there's lots of oil, there's lots of scenes in the desert, and frankly, it is Tintin at its best, being highly comic. It's also a book which apparently was rewritten 3 times for various reasons over a period of about 30 years. So for mega Tintin buffs, I'm sure they might love to discover all the different versions, but all of them very much involved the black gold, which is the oil, and very much relating to the petrol too. Vita, it's great to see you here this evening. I hope you're having a good time and possibly joining us from Oxford. So back to Cities of Salt. This novel by Abdul Rahman Munif was first published in Lebanon in 1984 and was immediately recognised as a major work of Arab literature. It was translated into English by Peter Theroux, and the novel is actually one of a quintet. Sorry, I was saying it was one of 4, but it's actually one of 5, which describes the far-reaching effects of the discovery of huge reserves of oil under a once idyllic oasis somewhere on the Arabian Peninsula. So this is quite a massive, huge, epic saga, highly political and very much based on the true history of the area. And Munif was very conscious that oil, as he said, is our one and only chance to build a future. And he said that the regimes in charge are ruining this chance. And in the novel and in its sequels, great oil-rich cities are soon built, and they're described as cities of salt because, as Munif explained to describe his title, he means that they're cities that offer no sustainable existence because when the waters come in, the first waves will dissolve the salt and reduce these great glass cities to dust. In antiquity, as you know, said Munif, many cities simply disappeared. It's possible to foresee the downfall of cities that are inhuman. With no means of livelihood, they won't survive. So as he saw it, the cities would be built on the riches of the oil, but then they would dissolve inevitably when the oil ran out. Another book which could be described as Petrofiction comes from Brazil, and it was published first in America, I believe, called Through the Arc of the Rainforest by Japanese-American author Karen Tai Yamashita, which is primarily set in Brazil. And it's a work of magical realism, but it goes through many different literary genres, incorporating satire and humour and addressing themes of globalization, transnationalism, migration, economic imperialism, environmental exploitation, socio-economic inequality, and techno-determinism. And that follows a very big cast of characters across national borders from Japan, Brazil, and the United States. So that's another really interesting piece of Petrofiction. Laughing John, great to see you here this evening, and Cyber Flaneurs, lovely to see you as well. I wonder if any of you have your own books that you come to think of when you think of petrol in fiction. And actually, just to go back to this idea of waiting in the queue to get your car filled up, what are the kinds of books that you actually want to read or be listening to? I would say you want to listen to something that's very distracting. And one of the books that I want to talk about this evening is a highly distracting novel, and it's a gripping read, which came to mind because it actually starts off with a horrible conflagration, which is caused by petrol. So this book, The Gargoyle by Andrew Davidson, is one, oh look, it's got a black cover because it's been burnt, which one that I have mentioned before when I did fire in literature, because it's very much about what happens when fire gets out of hand and someone gets hideously burned. And it is quite a overblown book in the way that it's written. It has moments of greatness. It's also very funny at times, and it has some really fantastic ideas, and it is a great story, and it's totally gripping. But it does at times get a bit carried away with itself. However, it is a great read. It slightly makes me think of Shantaram by Gregory David Robertson as well, which is also a great read, but occasionally has some really cheesy writing. Anyway, The Gargoyle begins with this hero whose name is actually never given to us, telling us all about a terrible car crash that he had, which turned him literally into a gargoyle. And I'll just read you a little bit of it to give you an idea of what the writing's like and what's actually happening at the start. There was a brief moment of weightlessness, a balancing point between air and earth, dirt and heaven. How strange, I thought. How like the moment between sleeping and falling, when everything is beautifully surreal and nothing is corporeal. how like floating towards completion. But as often happens in that time between existing in the world and fading into dreams, this moment over the edge ended with the ruthless jerk back to awareness. A car crash seems to take forever, and there's always a moment in which you believe that you can correct the error. Yes, you think, it's true that I'm plummeting down the side of a mountain in a car that weighs about £3,000. It's true that it's 100 feet to the bottom of the gully, but I'm sure that if only I twist the steering wheel very hard to one side, everything will be okay. Once you've spun that steering wheel around and found it doesn't make any difference, you have this one clear, pure thought. Oh shit! For a glorious moment, you achieve the empty bliss that Eastern philosophers spend their lives pursuing. See what I mean? I do think he's quite funny. But following this transcendence, your mind becomes a supercomputer capable of calculating the gyrations of your car, multiplying that by the speed of the fall over the angle of descent, factoring in Newton's laws of motion, and in a split second, coming to the panicked conclusion that this is gonna hurt like hell. Your car gathers speed down the embankment, bouncing. Your hypothesis is quickly proven correct. It is indeed quite painful. Your brain catalogues the different sensations. There's the flipping end over end, the swirling disorientation, and the shrieks of the car as it practices its unholy yoga. There's the crush of metal pressing against your ribs. There's the smell of the devil's mischievousness, a pitchfork in your arse, and sulphur in your mouth. The bastard's there, all right. Don't doubt it. That's just a little glimpse of what happens at the beginning when he's just about to be hideously burnt. He actually does describe pain incredibly powerfully. So it's not a book for the squeamish. He does tell you a lot about what's going on with his body and his skin because he gets completely burnt and melted. It's all his fault. He's an absolute idiot. He was driving coked up to the eyeballs. He was also drinking bourbon, which he then spilt all over his lap. So when his car flew off the edge of a cliff, because he had a weird vision, there's no guesses why he had that vision, he catches fire in hideous ways, and it all becomes really rather grim. Tracy, you're just saying you're hoping you can watch this later. You will be able to watch it later, either on Facebook or on YouTube. I do put all of these videos onto YouTube, by the way, so you can always catch it there later, and it does stay on Facebook as well for a long time. So Tracy, do not worry, it will still be there. So going back to the Gargoyle and this poor guy who was an idiot, covered in whiskey, having this awful, hideous burn, he gets completely incinerated, but luckily is saved by the fact that his car ends up in a lake or creek, so his life is saved, but he is awfully charred and he becomes this gargoyle-like creature. We then witness him being healed in a hospital over a period of many months, and it does go into great and rather unpleasant detail about the healing process, but it is actually rather fascinating, which is why it's also such a gripping read. Quite a good one to read aloud as well, I have to say. And he initially wants to die. He basically believes that he's going to get well enough in order to then kill himself when he comes out of the hospital. But he does gradually fall in love, would you believe it? Because he meets a remarkable woman who comes to find him, and she claims that she's known him in another life, and she has a lot of fantastic stories to tell. She's a bit of a Scheherazade type person who entertains him with stories to keep him alive, and he does recover his mojo, and he enters into this strange and compelling love story with the mysterious woman who seems to have been reincarnated 25 times in her life. So this is possibly the right kind of book to be reading or listening to while you're queuing for petrol, because it is gripping and It's only the very beginning which will give you the heebs-jeebs about driving and potentially the terrible effects of setting petrol on fire. So you don't have to linger on that thought for too long. Moving on, another great piece of petrol-related fiction is a book called Fortune by Amanda Smythe. I'm afraid I don't have any or hardly any versions of the books themselves this week. A lot of them I've been listening to on audio or reading on Kindle. So this book is another one. Amanda Smythe wrote a book called Fortune, which is based on a real life tragedy which happened to relatives of Amanda Smythe. Might be pronounced Smith. It's with a Y. And she lived in Trinidad for a period of her life. And I too spent a period of my life in Trinidad. So I'm always particularly interested in books that come from that beautiful island. And I did go searching for fiction that came from Trinidad relating to petrol, because there was a huge epic oil boom in Trinidad in the 1920s, which had immense repercussions on the socio-economic history of the island, which when we lived there in the 1980s were still rippling down. So Fortune is a fascinating portrait of Trinidad, an island that's beautiful but poor, troubled and full of danger. So the story is about Eddie Wade, who's recently returned to the US oil fields. He's determined to sink his own well and make his fortune in 1920s Trinidad in the oil rush. His sights are set on Sonny Chatterjee's failing cocoa estate, where the ground is so full of oil you can put a stick in the ground and see it bubble up, which I do feel like I actually did see happen in Trinidad, although in reality I probably didn't. But I did go to the Pitch Lake in Trinidad, which you can see bubbling up around you, and that's a kind of oil-related product. When a fortuitous meeting with the businessman Tito Fernandez brings Eddie the investor he desperately needs, the three men enter into a partnership. A friendship between Tito and Eddie begins that will change their lives forever, not least when the oil begins to gush. But their partnership also brings Eddie into contact with Ada, Tito's beautiful wife, and as much as they try, they can't avoid the attraction that they feel for each other. So Fortune, which, as I said earlier, is based on real life events, which I think did involve a real tragedy in the history of the writer Amanda Smythe, catches Trinidad at a moment of historical change in the 1920s, whose consequences reverberate down to the present, and also concerning climate change and environmental destruction. It's a story of love and ambition, and it, in a way, feels a bit like a Greek tragedy. So that is a great one, and it's also endorsed by Monique Ruffy, who gave it very great praise, saying, Fortune is a perfect novel, a masterwork of Caribbean literature, which will stay with me for a long time. And Monique Ruffy, as I'm sure you know, recently has been winning many great accolades and prizes for her fantastic book, The Mermaid of Black Conch, which is one of my favourite reads of the last 12 months. So another fantastic piece of Petrofiction is a book called Petro Plague by Amy Rogers, which is a bit of a thriller type dystopian novel in which bacteria turns all the gasoline in LA into vinegar. Petro Plague is about a research scientist called Christina Gons, who expected her research to change the world, but not in the way that it actually did. She wanted to use biotechnology to free America from its dependence on Middle Eastern oil. But an act of eco-terrorism unleashes her genetically modified bacteria into the fuel supply of Los Angeles, turning the gasoline into vinegar. When the city is paralyzed and slipping towards anarchy, Christina must find a way to rein in the microscopic monster she created. But not everyone wants to cure the Petro plague. Some will do whatever it takes to spread it. Um, so it goes from university laboratories in LA to the wilds of the Angeles National Forest, and they struggle against enemies seen and unseen, ratcheting up the tension with every chapter. So that's more of a thriller type novel, but it's a really great and gripping read, which I think you might really enjoy if you need a bit of distraction from reality. And I also think it would be a good one to listen to or read when queuing for petrol, because it will show you how much worse things could really be, and hopefully make you feel thankful that it's not as bad as it is in the novel. Another novel which is very much based on the idea of petrol, but in a much more metaphorical way, is a much more quiet book after talking about these more kind of exciting thrillerish type novels, which is actually called Petrol, as its title, by Martina Evans, who is a poet, novelist, and teacher who comes originally from Ireland. She grew up in County Cork, and she actually grew up in a country pub, shop, and petrol station. And she's the youngest of 10 children. She's obviously very much affected by having grown up partly in a place right next to a petrol station. And she's been publishing her poetry since 1990. This is her first novel. And the novel has been called something of a prose poem because it's very much written in beautiful poetic form. It's really all about grief. It's about a girl who's mourning her mother who's recently died, and the girl is only about 12 or 13 in the novel. I'm going to read you a little bit of it to give you a sense of the way that it's written. It's a very much a evocative, gentle, interesting, and beautifully written book. It wasn't that dark with the lights from the cars outside and the glow from the major cigarette sign lighting up the page, but sometimes the mice wouldn't stop running inside the panelling, and there was the strange smell from the possessed girl's room in The Exorcist, and having to go to the bathroom, and passing Mammy's grotto where the cabbage green snake was biting the Virgin Mary's foot, and I was always afraid Mammy's ghost would appear to me above the green linoleum stairs. See, that's a great paragraph, which is incredibly evocative. Immediately, she's worrying about Mummy's ghost appearing above the green linoleum stairs. And for me, that immediately conjures up a kind of petrol-y smell. It's probably the green linoleum. And also, she does mention the smell from the possessed girl's room in The Exorcist, which I actually don't know what that smell would be, but it's quite a terrifying idea, whatever it is, and could be quite petrol-y. It's a great example of the author Martina Evans' technique in action, because she has this very evocative portrait of a scared of the dark girl lit by car light and neon. And then you have the mice scrabbling around behind the wall, behind her bedroom wall. And she does interweave dream reality into the picture, just as it interweaves its way into the fearful girl's perceptions. So it's a very poetic, beautiful book, which is one to read perhaps in a quiet moment, possibly not so ideal for reading when you're queuing for petrol. I feel that the best books to read in that instance might be ones which are a bit more instantly gripping and distracting. But there are a couple that definitely come to mind, including, maybe controversially, Crash by Jg Ballard, which is a novel all about a kind of obsessive love for cars in a rather weird and possibly quite disturbing way, because the hero in Crash is just obsessed with the idea of dying in a car. Maybe this is not the perfect thing to read while you're waiting in a queue for petrol, unless you are of a very dark frame of mind. It is an amazing novel, one of my husband's favourite books and also films. Um, and I wonder if any of you have read it out there. Do tell me if you have. I did find it incredibly disturbing, and I've just been reading an essay about it by Zadie Smith, who initially hated it, which is really how I have felt about it for a long time. But she came round to see the beauty of it and to appreciate its odd brilliance. And I do think Jg Ballard is an amazing, fantastic writer. But maybe I would say, as a bibliotherapist, Crash is not the book to read when you're waiting in a petrol queue. However, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, which is another dystopian novel, I think is a fantastic one to read when you are needing to be distracted through the tedium of being in a long queue, because it's such a brilliant book. It's all about so many issues which are relevant to our society today. If you haven't read it yet, it's an absolute essential read, and it is relevant to the topic tonight because it's all about burning books. It relates to fascism. Ray Bradbury was actually inspired by thinking about Hitler to write this book because he remembered hearing about the books being burned in the middle of cities, and that's what got him thinking about this idea of a dystopian future. And Bradbury was also very much anti screens and TV, and in this book the screens are as big as the walls, and everyone's completely addicted to the screens and spend all their times looking at screens. Sounds familiar? But he does have some really fantastic descriptions of burning books and why that's a terrible thing. And I'm just going to read you a little bit to get you in the mood once again, thinking about petrol and gasoline. This is the very beginning of the book. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass nozzle in his fists, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. With his symbolic helmet numbered 451 on his stolid head, and his eyes all orange flame with the thought of what came next, he flicked the igniter, and the house jumped up in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky red and yellow and black. He strode in a swarm of fireflies. He wanted, above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace, while the flapping pigeoned winged books died on the porch and lawn of the house. While the books went up in sparkling whirls and blew away on a wind turned dark with burning, Montag grinned the fierce grin of all men singed and driven back by flame. He knew that when he returned to the firehouse, he might wink at himself, a minstrel man, burnt corked in the mirror. Later, going to sleep, he would feel the fiery smile still gripped by his face muscles in the dark. It never went away, that smile. It never ever went away, as long as he remembered. Brilliant start to the book. It gets you really instantly gripped, and despite having the flamey cover and we know the theme being about burning books, it actually is a rather exhilarating and, I think, ultimately positive book. Helen, glad that you were going to suggest The Gargoyle. Is that one that you like? Let me know. It's a great read, and actually I think it is probably, of all the ones I'm mentioning tonight, it might be the best one to actually just pick up and read and keep you gripped through a long, tedious couple of hours perhaps while you queue for petrol if you are in the UK. Another one I wanted to mention is a book called Gasoline, which is by the Catalan author Quim Monzo. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Quim. It's probably Quim. Um, and his novel has been translated into English, and it's very much about the art world. So it's one that would have been great for me to mention on my last Bibliotherapy Live, which was on Damien Barr's Facebook and Instagram, because this is totally a kind of postmodern novel all about the art world in New York. And it's about an artist called Heribert, who's a painter, who is having a crisis where he literally can't paint. He's got to fill two galleries in time for an imminent double show. But instead of working, he wallows in indifference and boredom, wandering the city streets, drinking in random bars, and visiting sex shops. As Heribert's career stagnates, another younger artist called Humbert, bizarrely, almost everyone's names in this book begin with an H, steps in to take advantage of Heribert's artistic and romantic slump. So, Gasoline by Quim Monzo is a novel that explores the joys and pitfalls of creativity and obsession, alternating whimsy and humour with dark moments of doubt. It's both heartbreaking and absurd, and it's a very much a postmodern kind of novel. And it's a great portrayal of artistic creation and unstable personalities. And I think that Gasoline, as far as I remember in the book, is purely a metaphorical concept. I'm assuming that it's the fuel that fuels your creative juices. So I wonder if people can relate to that. It's an interesting thought. Moving on and back to Jg Ballard, we were mentioning Crash earlier, which I think is a book which is possibly not the best one to read if you are literally in a queue for petrol, because it's all about everything that can go wrong in a car and about really deliberately having accidents in a strange kind of eroticized fetishistic version of driving and having a relationship with a car. But The Drowned World, also by Jg Ballard, would be a better book perhaps to read while you are queuing for petrol, because it is another dystopian novel which is absolutely brilliant, set I think in 2045, where the world has completely warmed up and London is completely submerged in a swamp, and everyone is trying to get around on boats for which they need petrol in order to get around. So petrol does play quite an important part in that novel as well. Then I also wanted to mention another excellent novel, which very much thanks to Viva Story in Missouri, who mentioned this on Twitter. She brought to my attention a novel called The Slinks, which is by Tatiana Tolstaya, which sounds like an absolutely brilliant book, which I must say I have not read. It's a Russian novel, which I'm now dying to read. So Viva Story, I actually don't know who you are. And indeed, I don't know your gender. So, sorry, I was calling you she. But if you are there, make yourself known. I'd love to know who you are. But anyway, Viva Story told me about The Slinks, which sounds like a fantastic novel by Tatiana Tolstaya, who was born in Leningrad in 1951 to an aristocratic family that includes the writers Leo and Alexei Tolstoy. So she has a fantastic literary pedigree. After completing a degree in classics at Leningrad State University, She worked for several years at a Moscow publishing house and then started publishing short stories in literary magazines. And her first story collection established her as one of the foremost writers of the Gorbachev era. I'm telling you all this because I feel really bad that I didn't know about her, and I'm now dying to read her books and short stories and find all about her. And she's also been the co-host of the Russian cultural interview TV program School for Scandal. Both her novel The Slinks and her collection of stories White Walls are now published by NYRB Classics. So we should all get hold of them because everyone's raving about them and saying how brilliant they are. And this novel is a post-apocalyptic novel, which is both amusing and frightening, with cynical and distrustful characters, which is an inventive take on dystopian literature. It's set in Moscow about 200 years after the blast, which is obviously some apocalyptic moment, where there's a primitive society of Alderners, or the survivors born before the event, and consequences, who are people with deformities born after the blast. So people catch mice, which form the staple food and a currency. And there are also half-human, four-legged degenerators who are used to pull sleighs. And almost everybody is afraid of the monster, the Slinks. And Beaver Story told me that gasoline plays a key part in the story, because at one point it's revealed where the gasoline is being hidden in the city, and this has huge consequences to everyone that's living there, because obviously everyone wants gasoline. So that sounds like a really fantastic and fascinating, unusual dystopian read, which I'm definitely going to get hold of, and would love to know if any of you also get hold of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So a couple of non-fiction books to mention. I discovered in my research for this evening a really great looking picture book of photos called It's a Gas, The Allure of the Gas Station, which is an amazing coffee table book, which I wish I could show you, but unfortunately don't have the physical copy, but I've seen the contents, which is a really gorgeous kind of coffee table book with all the most beautiful gas stations in the world. And it's got all these amazing gas stations, one which is attached to a giant redwood tree, some which are just incredible pieces of architecture, some that look like beautiful Chinese pagodas, and they're all gas stations. So that's a really fun book called It's a Gas, The Allure of the Gas Station, published by Gestalten. And it has a preface written by US talk show host Jay Leno. Then another couple of non-fiction books to mention before we come to an end, for people that have a genuine interest in the history of oil and petrol. There's a brilliant book called The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money and Power by Daniel Jurgen, which recounts the panoramic history of oil and the struggle for wealth and power that's always surrounded oil. This struggle has shaken the world economy, dictated the outcome of wars, and transformed the destiny of men, women, and nations. It's as much a history of the 20th century as of the oil industry itself. It goes from the drilling of the first well in Pennsylvania through two Great World Wars to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and Operation Desert Storm. So that is a fascinating read. Another brilliant one is Blood and Oil, a prince's memoir of Iran from the Shah to the Ayatollah, which was actually published in 1991, I think. So it's pre recent world events, which have made the history of oil in Iran a completely different story. But it is a really fascinating story that tells you all about the beginnings of the oil industry in Iran, because Iran was the first country in the Middle East to develop an oil industry, and oil has been central to its tumultuous 20th century history. It was a finalist for the Penn West Award, and it tells the epic inside story of the battle for Iranian oil. It was written by a prominent member of one of Iran's most powerful aristocratic families. And Prince Manuka Farman Farmayan was raised in a harem at the heart of Iran's imperial court. He describes with great wit and detail the days when he served as the Shah's oil advisor and pioneered the partnership that resulted in OPEC. It's actually beautifully written and quite an impressive piece of historical writing. Then there's another one called Drowning in Oil by Lauren Steffi, which is all about the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, which begins with the series of explosions that rocked the Deepwater Horizon, the immense semi-submersible drilling platform leased by British Petroleum, as it then was, located 40 miles off the Louisiana coast. The ensuing inferno claimed 11 lives, and it would rage uncontained for 2 days until its wreckage sank to a final resting place nearly a mile beneath the waves. On the ocean floor, the unit's wellhead then erupted, and over the next 10 weeks, as repeated attempts to cap the geyser failed, an estimated 200 million gallons of oil spewed into the Gulf of Mexico, eventually lapping up on beaches as far away as Florida. So this was written by award-winning business reporter Lauren Steffi, and it's an absolutely gripping narrative of this catastrophe, and it has a rather damning indictment of BP and their winner takes it all philosophy, which had terrible and long-lasting consequences on the economy and the environment. So that's called Drowning in Oil by Lauren Steffi. Just one last thing to mention is that after that disaster, The Guardian commissioned 10 short stories in 2011, which they commissioned from the likes of China Mieville and Robin Yassin Kassab, and many more. And you can find those short stories online, and they're all about different aspects of oil. The China Mieville one is a bit of a sci-fi type short story. Some of the others are much more human and small, and just the minutiae of what oil can mean to different people. So those short stories can be found on the Guardian website online. So that's just a few great books which I hope you have enjoyed thinking about petrofiction and oil in literature. If any of you have other favourite books which relate to that theme, do please tell me. I'm always keen to discover more. And I also do wonder if any of you have been listening to audiobooks or trying to read while you've been waiting for petrol, or have you actually just been avoiding the whole thing and trying to stay at home and not get involved, and indeed not drive, thus having more time to read? And I wonder, if so, what you've been reading. I will be back next week on my own channel again, and I'm not sure what the theme will be, but I'll let you know in advance. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. Good night. Goodbye, cyberflaneurs. Great to see you. Night, everyone. Thanks for coming.